The great hall of Stratton Park was cold for October, and Josiah Greaves had not removed his hat. He stood at the center of the stone floor, a broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to raise his voice. And his daughter Clara stood 6 feet away from him, her hands pressed flat against her skirts so that no one in that room could see them shaking. The servants had not been dismissed. That was deliberate. Josiah Greaves had always understood that witnesses were tools, and he had arranged this audience with the same precision he brought to every transaction that mattered. Her husband Nathaniel stood to one side, his face composed into the careful blankness Clara had spent 8 years learning to read as a wall. The Dowager Countess Augusta sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, perfectly still, her eyes on her son. The fire behind her was the only warm thing in the room. Clara could hear the wind finding the gaps in the window frames, and she could hear her own pulse, and she could hear her father drawing breath before he spoke. And she knew, with the particular clarity that comes just before something breaks, that her life was about to divide into a before and an after. "I will say this plainly," Josiah said. "Because plain speech is a courtesy I am still willing to extend." He looked at Clara the way he looked at ledger columns that had not balanced, not with anger, but with a specific, practiced disappointment. "You will be the countess this house was paid for. You will conduct yourself as this family's position requires. You will return to your place, and you will remain in it. Or you are no daughter of mine, and you will leave this house today, his house, mind, with nothing that I provided." He paused. The fire cracked. "Stay his wife," Josiah said, "or leave his house. Those are the terms." Clara's hands were shaking. She was aware of them distantly, the way one is aware of a thing that belongs to the body and not to the will. She was also aware of Nathaniel, who had not moved and had not spoken, and of Augusta, who had not yet looked away from the fire. She was aware of the footman near the door, a boy of perhaps 17, who was staring at a fixed point on the wall, with the rigid concentration of someone trying to be invisible. She said nothing for a moment. She let the silence sit in the room, and she breathed through it. And then she turned and walked the full length of the hall, her heels on the stone, each step deliberate, audible, and put her hand on the door. She had expected, in the walking, to feel something give way inside her. Instead, she felt very clear. Behind her, she heard the sound of Augusta rising from her chair. Not the sound of an old woman rising slowly. The sound of a woman who had made a decision and was acting on it without hesitation. "Nathaniel." Augusta's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries to every corner of a room. "I have sat in this house for 37 years and watched what was done to it and to the people inside it, and I have said nothing. I will not sit here tonight and watch a woman be owned twice in one lifetime. I will not do it." She walked past her son without looking at him again. She walked past Josiah, who did not move, and she crossed the hall and came to stand beside Clara at the door. And she looked at her daughter-in-law once, a brief, direct look that said everything that needed saying. And then she opened the door herself, and the two of them walked out into the autumn dusk together. The doors closed behind them. Inside the hall, the fire went on burning. The footman went on staring at the wall. Josiah Greaves stood where he had stood, hat still on, and said nothing. And Nathaniel, the Earl of Stratton, stood to one side and looked at the closed doors for a long time before he looked at his father-in-law, and neither man spoke. By 8 o'clock that evening, the carriage was loaded. Clara had gone upstairs herself for Posy, finding her daughter already half asleep in the nursemaid's arms, and had carried her down wrapped in the wool blanket from her bed. Posy had opened her eyes once, registered her mother's face, and gone back to sleep without asking a question. She was 6 years old, and she trusted Clara the way small children trust the people who have never let them fall. Augusta had directed the loading of 3 trunks with the economy of a woman who had, at some point in her life, done this before. She carried the small portrait case herself and put it on the carriage seat beside her. And when Clara glanced at it, an object she had never noticed before, small and dark, locked with a brass clasp, Augusta said nothing and looked out the window. The village of Wellborn was 12 miles east, and Larch House was a mile beyond the village, a modest Georgian property rented on a short lease by a family who had recently gone to the continent. 4 bedrooms, a kitchen garden that had been let go, a parlor with decent light, and a fireplace that drew well. Augusta had known of it for reasons she did not explain, and she had sent a letter that afternoon before the carriage was ready, and by the time they arrived, the housekeeper, Mrs. Avery, had a fire going in the main rooms and cold supper laid on the table. Clara carried Posy inside and put her down on the narrow bed in the room that would be hers and tucked the blanket around her, and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at her daughter's sleeping face. The dark lashes, the small fist curled against the pillow, and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what the evening had cost. Then she went downstairs, sat down at the writing table in the parlor, and opened the household account book she had carried in her own bag. She had kept figures in her head for 8 years. She had managed the household expenditures of Stratton Park through the housekeeper, quietly, without ever allowing Nathaniel or anyone else to see that she understood exactly what was spent and where. Because a countess who smelled of the counting house was an embarrassment her father had warned her against. She had hidden it the way some women hid letters, folded into the lining of ordinary days. She opened the account book to the first page and wrote the date at the top in her own hand, and began. The morning of the ultimatum, she had passed Nathaniel in the gallery. He had been coming down the east staircase as she was going up, and for a moment on the landing, their hands had been on the banister at the same time. Hers below, his above, separated by a foot of polished oak, and both of them had withdrawn at the same instant, without speaking or meeting the other's eyes. She had continued up. He had continued down. That was the marriage, made physical. But beneath that memory, pressed flat by years of keeping it there, was another one. The winter of the 2nd year, when she had fallen asleep in the library over a book she had been pretending to read, and woken to find a shawl drawn over her shoulders. Her husband's shawl, she had known it by the smell of it. He had not been in the room when she woke. He had never mentioned it. She had never mentioned it. But she had kept the memory the way you keep a stone from a place you are not sure you will see again. She was thinking of it, not deliberately, but the way a mind returns to certain things in the small hours. When the letter arrived. 4 days after they left Stratton Park, a sealed letter was delivered to Larch House, addressed to Lady Stratton. It was in Josiah's hand. Clara read it standing at the parlor window. It was not a letter. It was a formal instrument of disownment, witnessed by Josiah's solicitor, stating that he recognized no further claim of blood or duty between himself and the woman formerly known as his daughter, and that any correspondence directed to him from Larch House would be returned unopened. It was written in the same tone he used for contract terminations. She had seen enough of those, as a girl, to know the register precisely. She folded it and put it in the account book under the front cover, and went back to her figures. 2 days after that, Augusta received a letter addressed to Nathaniel, care of Larch House. She brought it to Clara without opening it. and Clara read it and sat down. Josiah's message to his son-in-law was brief. He required the child return to her grandfather's care within the fortnight. If Nathaniel declined to act as the instrument of this reasonable request, Josiah would take the matter of the Stratton name's financial history, its debts, its dependencies, its documented obligations, to every county family and every London connection he possessed. He would not need to invent anything. The truth, he wrote, would be sufficient. Nathaniel's name appeared 4 times in the letter. Each time it appeared, it was as the agent of the demand, the hand that would deliver the child, the man who would carry the message, the instrument through which Josiah intended to act. Clara read it twice, and then set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. She had thought, walking out of Stratton Park, that she was removing herself and her daughter from Josiah's reach. She understood now that she had only changed the shape of the trap. Society at Wellbourne received the situation with the particular efficiency of a community that had been waiting for something to confirm its existing conclusions. The invitations that had been sparse before now stopped entirely. 2 calls were made in the first week, both by women who came, Clara understood, to look rather than to offer, and neither visit was repeated. The county conversation, as Augusta reconstructed it from what Mrs. Avery's niece reported from the village, had settled on a narrative. The seat Countess had abandoned her earl and gone to ground in a rented house. And whatever the reasons, a woman who left her husband's roof had effectively declared herself ineligible for the social consideration she had purchased at such expense 8 years ago. Clara noted this in the same spirit in which she noted the household accounts. It was information. It told her the precise dimensions of the space she now occupied. Nathaniel came to Wellbourne on the 9th day after they left Stratton Park. He arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was already going gray, and asked to speak with Clara. She was in the kitchen garden when Mrs. Avery came to find her, and she stood for a moment with her hands still dirty from pulling up the dead runner beans. And then she went inside, washed her hands, and sent word to the front that she was not receiving. She heard the sound of his horse on the drive, arriving and then, after some time, departing. He came again 4 days later, on a morning when the rain was coming down in the heavy, purposeful way of autumn rain that intends to continue all day. She heard the knock and heard Mrs. Avery's voice, and heard a man's voice reply, lower, and then silence. She did not go to the window. She waited until she heard the horse again, and then she went to the front door herself because she did not know why she was going, and opened it. On the stone step, wrapped in one of Posy's old handkerchiefs and placed precisely in the center of the step so that it would not be missed, was a small china doll, with a painted blue dress and a chip on her left hand, where she had been dropped once on the Stratton Park kitchen floor. Posy had left her behind in the nursery. Clara had not noticed until 2 days after their departure. When Posy had asked for her and Clara had told her the doll was at Stratton Park, and watched her daughter absorb this with the quiet resignation of a child who has learned not to make demands. He had ridden 3 hours in the rain to put a doll on a doorstep. Clara stood in the doorway, holding the china doll, and looking at the drive, which was empty now, and at the lane beyond, which was also empty, and at the rain coming down through the bare elm trees at the property's edge. She stood there for quite some time before she went back inside, and she did not put the doll down on any surface, but carried it upstairs herself and set it on Posy's pillow. The letters began arriving the following week. Short letters, in Nathaniel's handwriting. She recognized it from 8 years of household correspondence passed through intermediaries, addressed to her directly, not through Augusta. They were not the letters she had expected. They did not argue. They did not reiterate Josiah's demands or advance his position. They asked instead specific and practical questions. Whether the chimney in the east bedroom had been attended to, because he knew from the estate records that Larch House had a flue problem in the east rooms. Whether Posey's winter coat had been brought, or whether it was still in the nursery wardrobe at Stratton Park, in which case he would have it sent. Whether the household had sufficient coal laid in for the coming cold. She read each letter twice. She answered the questions. The chimney had been seen to, the coat was here, the coal was sufficient. And she sent the replies by Mrs. Avery's niece. And she sat with the letters afterward and tried to make them fit the shape of Nathaniel she had carried for 8 years. The shape was this: a man who had married her because his family needed her father's money, and who had spent the years since in the polite, impenetrable coldness of a person who considered himself above his bargain. She had read his silence as contempt. She had read his distance as the aristocracy's verdict on her blood, her origin, her father's mills and counting houses, and the particular smell of commerce that no amount of title could quite launder away. The letters did not fit that reading. She acknowledged this to herself on a Thursday evening, sitting by the parlor fire with Posey asleep in her lap and the most recent letter in her hand, and found that the acknowledgment opened something she was not yet prepared to look at directly. Augusta, meanwhile, kept the portrait case on the shelf above her writing table, and deflected every question about it with a calm that Clara had come to recognize as the calm of a woman who has decided something and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. "What is in it?" Clara asked her one morning, directly, because she had been indirect about it for 2 weeks and had learned nothing. Augusta looked at her for a moment. "There are debts," she said, "that I have not yet found the courage to pay." She picked up her pen and returned to her correspondence, and Clara understood that the subject was closed for now, and that when Augusta chose to open it again, it would be on her own terms. Nathaniel arrived a third time on a Tuesday, and this time Clara sent word that he could be shown into the parlor. He came in still wearing his riding coat, and he stood across the room from her in the way of a man who was being careful about the space between them. And they regarded each other for a moment in a silence that was different from the silences at Stratton Park, less armored somehow, and more honest. "I am not here on my father-in-law's behalf," he said. "I want you to know that before anything else." "I had gathered that," Clara said. "Sit down." He sat. He was 40 years old in the winter light, and he looked, Clara thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was only now beginning to understand that he had been carrying it at all. They spoke for 30 minutes. It was stiff and it was careful, and it was nothing like the conversation she had imagined having with him, which had tended, in her private rehearsals, toward anger and clarity, and the satisfaction of finally saying everything she had kept. Instead, he asked about Posey's reading lessons, and she told him about the primer they had found in the Larch House bookcase, and he said something about the elm trees in the lane needing to be seen to before the winter, and she agreed. Then, as he rose to leave, he turned back. "There are 3 things I want you to know," he said. "In the summer of the 3rd year of our marriage, your father asked me to dismiss your personal maid on the grounds that she was encouraging you in habits unsuitable to your station. I told him she would remain, and she did. In the winter of the 5th year, he asked me to restrict your correspondence to letters he had reviewed. I told him that was not a thing I was willing to do. In the autumn of last year, he told me to forbid you from going to Wellborn for the harvest fair with Posey, because the Greaves family had a connection there he did not want examined. I told him the decision was yours to make." He said these things in a flat, even voice, looking at a point just above her shoulder. "I did not tell you," he said. "That was wrong. I want you to know it now." He left before she could answer, and she sat in the parlor for a long time after his horse had gone, and she did not know what to do with what he had given her. But she knew she could not put it away where she had been keeping the rest of him. The portrait case was on Augusta's shelf on a Wednesday morning when Posey found it unlocked. She had come into the room looking for her grandmother and, finding it empty, had done what 6-year-old children do with objects that are small and interesting and within reach. She turned it over in her hands, worked the clasp, and opened it. When Augusta found her, Posey was sitting on the floor with the case open on her knees, studying the miniature inside with the focused attention she brought to anything she found genuinely interesting. "He has Papa's chin," Posey said. She looked up at her grandmother. "The little painted man. He has Papa's chin exactly." Augusta sat down in her chair without speaking. She held out her hand, and Posey gave the case back without protest and went off in search of her doll. Augusta sat with the case open in her lap and looked at the miniature for a long moment. Clara, who had come in behind her daughter, stood in the doorway and waited. "Soon," Augusta said, to no one in particular. "It will be soon." That same week, Josiah sent Nathaniel a written instruction, formal, witnessed, delivered by a man on horseback who waited in the lane for a response. The instruction was direct. "Go to Wellborn and bring the child back to her grandfather's house." The tone made clear that this was a final request before Josiah moved to other methods. Nathaniel arrived at Larch House at midday. He was shown into the parlor where Clara and Augusta were both present, and he stood in the center of the room and looked at the letter in his hand, and then at the two women, and he said, "There is a man waiting in the lane for my answer." "What is your answer?" Clara asked. "I have not yet given it," Nathaniel said. "I wanted to give it here, in front of you." He folded the letter. "I will not be the hand that takes your daughter," he said. "I will not do it. Whatever he threatens and whatever it costs, I will not carry Posey out of this house against your will. I am going to tell the man in the lane to go back and say so. And I want you both to hear me say it first." Augusta said nothing. She set the portrait case on the table in front of her with a deliberateness that made Clara look at it. Nathaniel went to the door, spoke to the waiting messenger in the lane, and came back. He stood in the parlor doorway, and Clara crossed the room to where he was standing, and he reached out and took her hand. Not in the formal way, not the way of people who are performing a gesture, but the way of someone who has decided something and is acting on it. And she let him hold it. His hand was cold from the ride, and it was perfectly steady. She did not pull away. After a moment, he released her without pressing further, and they stood in the same room in a silence that was, for the first time, not hostile. That evening, Augusta opened the portrait case and told them everything. She did it at the parlor table, with the lamp between them and the case open and the miniature face up on the wood. She spoke in the same quiet, measured voice she used for everything. But her hands, Clara noticed, were not entirely still. "The man in the portrait is Lemuel Calvert," Augusta said. "He was the elder son, the rightful heir to Stratton Park and everything that came with it." She reached into the case and took out the miniature, and beneath it, folded into a compartment that Clara had not noticed, was a set of papers. Old, dense with legal writing, sealed with a wax impression that had cracked along one edge. 2 generations back, Lemuel Calvert was declared legally incapacitated by his younger brother on the basis of testimony that was purchased, Augusta said. The younger brother inherited. The estate, the title, the fortune, all of it passed on a foundation that was built from a lie. Lemuel had a son before the declaration. That son had a daughter. Her name is Mrs. Iris Dunmore, and she lives in a cottage at the edge of the county, and she has no idea what she is owed. The room was very quiet. My late husband knew, Augusta said. He knew before he inherited, and he kept the knowledge, and he kept the papers, and he kept his silence, because the alternative was to give back everything he had. I found the papers in his study 6 months after he died. I have kept them for 15 years. She looked at her son. That was my sin. The original fraud was his. Nathaniel reached across the table and took the papers. He read them in the lamplight, slowly and carefully, turning each page with the methodical attention of a man who does not intend to misunderstand anything. When he reached the end, he went back to the beginning and read 2 of the pages again. Then he set them down. Before I say anything, he said, I need to ask you once, plainly. Is this complete? Is there anything missing that would allow someone to challenge the proof? It is complete, Augusta said. I have spent 15 years reading it. There is nothing missing. Nathaniel closed the portrait case. He did not speak for a long time. Clara watched him and did not try to fill the silence, because she understood that he was not hesitating. He was arriving somewhere, and the arriving required time. He knew, Nathaniel said at last. Before he arranged the marriage, he found this. Yes, Augusta said, and he has held it ever since as the thing that would keep us in line. Her voice was steady. Yes. Nathaniel sat back. Something in his face had shifted, not broken, but resettled. The way a thing looks when it has been carrying weight at an angle for so long that the straightening of it is its own kind of violence. Then the house was never mine to give, he said. Not cleanly. No, Augusta said. It was not. Clara looked at the portrait case on the table. She thought of Posey's voice that morning. He has Papa's chin. And she thought of the miniature face and the way resemblance worked across generations like an argument that refused to stay buried. She thought of Mrs. Iris Dunmore in her cottage at the edge of the county, living in the obscurity of someone who has been robbed of everything and does not know by whom. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything yet, because there was nothing to say until Josiah moved again, and they did not have to wait long. The written ultimatum came 3 days later. Josiah addressed it to Nathaniel and delivered it by his own solicitor, who was shown into the parlor and read it aloud at Josiah's instruction, so that there could be no dispute afterward about whether it had been received and understood. Josiah's terms were these. Within the fortnight, Nathaniel would comply with all outstanding requests: the return of the child, Clara's resumption of her position at Stratton Park, and a written acknowledgement of Josiah's ongoing authority in matters affecting the Greaves investment. Or Josiah would take the matter of the suppressed Calvert claim to every legal and social body that would receive it. He would ruin them publicly, financially, and permanently. He would ensure that the name of Stratton was associated in every quarter with fraud and concealment. The solicitor folded the paper and waited. "Tell him I have received it," Nathaniel said. "That is all." When the solicitor had gone, the three of them sat with the reality of the fortnight laid out before them like a map of a country they were going to have to cross. "He will do it," Clara said, not as a question. "Yes," Nathaniel said, "he will do it." He looked at her. "There is going to be a public scandal regardless of what we decide. The question is whether we are the ones who confess it or the ones who are exposed." Clara understood immediately what he was proposing. She also understood what it would cost. "Posey?" she said. His expression did not change. "Yes." The scandal, when it came, would be the kind that attached itself to children in schoolrooms and drawing rooms for years. Clara knew this. She had grown up as a manufacturer's daughter in a society that did not forget the origin of money, and she knew precisely how a story of fraud and restitution would be told about a 6-year-old girl who had done nothing at all. "She needs to go," Clara said, "before it breaks. Somewhere outside the county." Augusta said quietly, "My oldest friend, Mrs. Hartley. She is in Shropshire, and she has known me since before I married, and she will ask no questions I do not want answered." They sent the letter that evening. The reply came in 2 days, and the arrangements were made, and on a Thursday morning Clara packed Posey's trunk herself. The winter coat, the primer, the china doll, the small wooden box of colored threads she used for her embroidery lessons. And she folded each thing with the careful attention of a woman who is trying to make an ordinary act out of something that is anything but. Posey came downstairs in her traveling coat and stood in the hall and looked at her mother. "How long?" she asked. "Not very long," Clara said. "A few weeks. You will like Mrs. Hartley. She has a garden with a maze." "Will you come for me?" "I will come for you myself," Clara said. "I promise." She watched the carriage until it rounded the corner at the end of the lane, and the sound of the wheels on the road faded into the ordinary sounds of the afternoon. And then she went back inside. She did not go to the parlor or to the kitchen or to any room where there was a fire and light and the presence of another person. She went to the hallway, and she stood there in the dark. The lamp was not lit, and the afternoon light did not reach that part of the house. And she stood very still, and she held herself together with the same effort she had been applying to herself for 3 weeks. And for a while, it worked. Then Nathaniel came in from the back garden where he had been speaking with Augusta, and he came through the kitchen and into the hall and found her there. He did not say anything. He crossed the hall and put his arms around her, and she felt the solidity of him, the actual physical weight and warmth of another person. And something in her that had been held rigid since the night in the great hall finally gave way entirely. She wept with the unguarded thoroughness of someone who has been keeping it in for too long, and he held her without speaking, without explaining himself, without offering the kind of comfort that is actually a request for the weeping to stop. He just held her steadily in the dark. When she quieted, they remained standing in the hall for some time, his arms still around her, neither of them moving. The house was very quiet. The lamp in the parlor sent a thin line of light under the door, and outside the wind had come up, and somewhere in the kitchen Mrs. Avery was moving around, making the sounds of ordinary life. Clara pulled back enough to look at him. In the dark, his face was difficult to read, but she was learning, slowly, to read it differently. "We are going to give it all back," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. She stepped back, and he let her. And they stood apart in the dark hall with the decision between them like something solid. In the morning, they sat at the parlor table with the portrait case open and the documents spread between them and the account book Clara had been keeping since the first night at Larch House, and the dawn light came gray and clear through the east window. "If we do this," Clara said, "the estate goes. The name, what the name was built on, goes. The income, the position, everything your family has held for 2 generations. You understand that?" "I understand it completely," Nathaniel said. "I want to be sure," Clara said, "because I need to know you are certain before I ask you to do it." "I am certain," he said. "Are you?" She looked at him across the table. This contained clipped man who had ridden 3 hours in the rain to return a child's doll, who had refused her father's demands in silence for years, who had stood in this parlor and said, "I will not be the hand." And she kissed him. Once, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who is not performing a gesture but beginning something. He was very still for a moment, and then his hand came up and touched her face, and when she drew back, his expression was the steadiest she had ever seen it. "A beginning," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes, a beginning." They did not wait for Josiah's fortnight to expire. They drove to the county town on a Monday in the plain hired carriage from the Wellborn livery, and they went to Mr. Pelham's office in the High Street, where Augusta had sent word 3 days before. Mr. Pelham was a careful man who had been a careful solicitor for 30 years and had seen a great deal, and he received them in his office with the particular composure of someone who has been told something extraordinary and has decided to treat it as ordinary until he has read all the documents himself. He read them. His clerk read them. Mrs. Iris Dunmore, who had been brought from her cottage by Augusta's letter and who sat in the corner chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of a woman who has been told something she had given up believing she would ever hear, read them. She was a woman of perhaps 60, small and upright, with gray hair and the kind of face that has been weathered into something that might be called distinguished if it had come with money. She said nothing while she read. When she finished, she set the papers down on Mr. Pelham's desk and looked at Nathaniel and Clara, and she said, "I knew there was something. My grandmother told me there was something, and I spent 40 years telling myself she had been confused by grief." "She was not confused," Nathaniel said. Mrs. Dunmore's voice was quiet. "No, I see that now." The formal documents were prepared over the course of 2 hours, with Mr. Pelham's clerk writing and Mr. Pelham reviewing, and Nathaniel reading every clause with the same methodical care he had brought to the original papers. They confessed the original fraud in the document's preamble, plainly, without euphemism, in the legal language that would make it a matter of public record. And they executed the restitution of Stratton Park and the Calvert fortune to Mrs. Iris Dunmore as the surviving heir of the rightful elder line. Nathaniel signed first. Clara signed as witness. Mr. Pelham and his clerk signed. Mrs. Dunmore signed. The ink was still drying when the door of the outer office opened. Josiah Greaves stood in the doorway. He had come on horseback, which meant someone in the county town had sent word quickly, and he was still wearing his riding coat, and his hat was on, as it had been in the great hall at Stratton Park. And his face had the same look, not angry, not yet, but calculating, running through the available instruments and finding them one by one. He looked at the document on Mr. Pelham's desk. He looked at the signatures. He looked at Mrs. Dunmore in the corner chair, and something behind his eyes shifted as he understood who she was and what her presence meant. "You have made a considerable mistake," he said. "No," Nathaniel said. He was standing at the desk with his hands at his sides, and his voice was the flattest Clara had ever heard it, not cold, but stripped of everything that was not true. "We have made a confession, on our own terms, before witnesses, in a document that is now a matter of public record. You came here to threaten us with exposure. The thing you were going to expose has already been confessed." Josiah looked at him. "A sin already confessed and publicly recorded," Nathaniel said, "cannot be purchased or threatened. You have nothing." "I have your name," Josiah said. "I have what this will do to every connection you have in every county in England." "You have a name that was built on a stolen foundation," Nathaniel said, "and we have just said so in writing. Whatever it does to our standing, it is the truth, and the truth is now in Mr. Pelham's records and not in your hands." He paused. "We know what this costs. We decided that before we came." Josiah looked at Clara. She met his eyes. She had been meeting his eyes since she was old enough to understand that he watched for the moment they dropped. And she had spent 8 years dropping them, and she was done with it. "You purchased a marriage," she said. "You told me once I was an investment that must show a return. I am telling you now that the investment is concluded. The ledger is closed. Whatever account you believed you held in me, it is settled. You will have nothing," Josiah said. "Nothing material, nothing social, nothing that the name you married into was worth. You understand that?" "We understand it exactly," Clara said. "We understood it before we signed." Josiah stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out, and the sound of his boots on the outer office floor was the last time Clara heard them. He left the county within the week. His social investment in the Stratton name was worthless, and his method, the management of people through secrets held in reserve, was now itself a matter of public record, because Mr. Pelham's documents described it plainly. There was nothing left to manage. Posey came home to Larch House on a Friday afternoon in early spring, brought by Augusta's friend in the Hartley carriage, with her traveling bag on her lap and her china doll in the crook of her arm. She came through the front door and looked around the narrow hallway, with its plain walls and the coat pegs that were too high for her and the smell of Mrs. Avery's bread from the kitchen. And she looked at Clara. "Is this where we live now?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "This is where we live." Posey considered this. "The garden is nicer than Stratton Park," she said. "It's more interesting. Things grow wherever they want." She went upstairs to find her room and her things, and Clara stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of small feet on the stairs and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since October. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way of things that have survived their own destruction and come out the other side into ordinary air. The estate and the name passed cleanly to Mrs. Dunmore, who moved into Stratton Park in April with a composure that suggested she had been preparing for this, in some deep part of herself, for a very long time. The county talked, as the county always talked, and then the county found other things to talk about, as it always did. What remained to the Strattons was Larch House, on its annual lease, the modest income from a small property in the north that had been Clara's marriage settlement and had never been touched by the Greaves arrangement, and Clara's account book open on the parlor table, its columns in her own hand, the careful arithmetic of a household that was small and solvent and entirely its own. Nathaniel had written to the 2 estates in the north that had offered him positions as land agent in years past. Men who had known him as a capable manager before the Greaves' money made management unnecessary. And one of them had replied already. It was honest work. It was work he knew how to do. He had sat with Clara the evening the letter arrived and read it to her, and she had said, without any particular ceremony, that she thought he should accept it. And he had agreed. Augusta kept her rooms at Larch House. She had given no indication of wanting any other arrangement, and no one had suggested one. She sat in the parlor in the evenings and read, and sometimes she and Clara played cards, and sometimes she told Posey stories about people Clara had never heard of. And the portrait case sat on her shelf, empty now, the papers delivered to Mr. Pelham's office and the miniature given to Mrs. Dunmore with a brief explanation. And she seemed, for the first time in the years Clara had known her, like a woman who was not carrying anything she had not chosen to carry. on a quiet evening in late April, with the fire low and Posey asleep upstairs, and the sound of Augusta in the next room turning a page. Nathaniel drew the parlor door closed and put out the lamp, and the house settled into its own darkness with the particular peace of a place that has become, without ceremony, a home. In the morning, the spring light came early through the east windows and lay across the parlor floor in long, pale bars. Posey's small shoes were on the front step, where she had left them the evening before, and the garden beyond was coming into its spring disorder. The kitchen beds pushing up their first green, the climbing rose on the south wall putting out new growth in all directions, the lawn doing exactly what it pleased. Through the far mist at the horizon, the gates of Stratton Park were just visible, wrought iron between stone pillars, belonging to another family now, growing already into the landscape of someone else's life. On the table in the parlor, open to the current week's figures, was the account book. The columns were in Clara's hand, clear, precise, the arithmetic of a woman who had been taught to treat this knowledge as a disqualification, and had discovered, at the cost of a great deal, that it was instead the most solid thing she owned. The threshold she had been cast out of in the autumn was a gate she no longer needed. The counting-house blood her father had sold and her husband's world had looked down upon had become, in the end, the engine of everything she had built and everything she intended to go on building. Outside, somewhere in the disordered garden, a bird started up. One clear, repeated note in the morning air. The account book lay open on the table. The columns added up.